The leather journal lay forgotten on the mahogany conference table, its pages still open to words that would change everything. Alexander Dominic Ashford, CEO of Ashford Global Industries, stood frozen in the empty boardroom at 11:47 at night, his hand hovering over what he knew he shouldn't read, but the first line had already seared itself into his mind. Sometimes I wonder what it would feel like to be seen, truly seen, by someone who doesn't need anything from me. The elegant handwriting belonged to Serafina Grace Monroe, his brilliant creative director, the woman whose quiet strength had captivated him for 2 years. And in that moment, holding her most intimate secrets in his hands, Alexander made a decision that would blur every line between professional and personal, between right and dangerously irresistible wrong. The rain fell against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ashford Global Tower like 1,000 whispered confessions, blurring the Manhattan skyline into an impressionist painting of light and shadow. Serafina Grace Monroe stood alone in her corner office on the 42nd floor, her reflection ghosted against the glass, a silhouette of exhaustion wrapped in tailored perfection. It was nearly midnight on a Thursday in late September, and the building had emptied hours ago. Everyone except Sarah, who had learned long ago that ambition required sacrifice, and silence was the price of being taken seriously in rooms where she was often the only woman, and almost always the only black woman, at the table. She gathered her papers, slipped her laptop into her cognac leather bag, and paused. The journal. Her private journal, the one she kept for thoughts too raw for colleagues, too vulnerable for friends, too honest for the polished version of herself she presented to the world. Where had she left it? A cold finger of panic traced down her spine. She'd had it this afternoon during the acquisition meeting. She always kept it with her during high-stakes presentations, a talisman of sorts, filled with affirmations and strategies and other things, private things. Sarah retraced her steps down the hushed corridor, her heels clicking against Italian marble, the executive conference room. She'd been reviewing notes there before the meeting, sitting alone at that massive table, gathering her thoughts. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open, empty. Relief started to bloom in her chest until she noticed it wasn't there, not on the table where she'd left it, not on any of the chairs, not on the credenza by the window. Gone. Her heart hammered against her ribs. That journal contained everything. Her professional observations, yes, but also her private thoughts about her colleagues, her insecurities about being constantly underestimated, her frustrations with being mistaken for an assistant despite her title. And worse, so much worse, it contained her secret desires. The things she wanted but would never ask for. The romantic fantasies she allowed herself only in ink and solitude. "Lost something?" The voice came from the shadows near the door, smooth as aged whiskey and twice as intoxicating. Sarah spun around, her breath catching. Alexander Dominic Ashford stepped into the ambient light that spilled from the hallway. At 38 years old, he carried power the way other men carried cologne, effortlessly and impossible to ignore. His dark suit jacket was gone, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms that spoke of more than boardroom battles. His hair, usually perfectly styled, was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his eyes, storm grey and unsettlingly direct, held something Sarah couldn't quite name. "Mr. Ashford." She fought to keep her voice steady, professional. "I didn't realize anyone else was still here." I could say the same. He moved closer, and she caught the scent of his cologne, cedar and bergamot with an undertone of something darker, more complex. "You work too late, Ms. Monroe." "So do you." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with practiced confidence, even as her mind raced. Had he seen it? Did he have it? Touché. A hint of a smile played at the corner of his mouth. Though I have an excuse. Insomnia. What's yours? Perfectionism. Ah, a more socially acceptable affliction. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, became more serious, more intent. You're looking for this. He pulled her journal from behind his back. The world tilted. Sarah's professional composure cracked for just a moment, long enough for Alexander to see the flash of vulnerability, the fear, the mortification. She reached for it, but he didn't immediately hand it over. How much? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat, tried again. How much did you read? The silence stretched between them like a tightrope, and Sarah felt herself balanced precariously on it, waiting for the fall. Enough, Alexander said finally, his voice lower now, almost gentle. Enough to know that you dropped it after the meeting. I found it on the floor near your chair, and enough to realize I should have closed it immediately. But you didn't. No. He had the decency not to pretend otherwise. I didn't. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, anger mixed with humiliation, mixed with something else she didn't want to name. That was private. I know. You had no right. You're absolutely correct. He held out the journal, and this time she took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact sent an unexpected current through her, sharp and electric. I apologize, Serafina. Truly. It was an invasion of your privacy, and there's no excuse for it. She clutched the journal to her chest like armor. Thank you for returning it. She turned to leave, desperate to escape before the tears of frustration she felt building could betray her further. But his voice stopped her. For what it's worth. Alexander's words were careful, measured. You are seen, more than you know. Sarah didn't turn around. Couldn't. If she looked at him now, with her defenses this fractured, she wasn't sure what he'd see in her eyes. So she walked out, her heels echoing down the empty corridor, carrying her secrets and her dignity as best she could. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Alexander remained in that conference room long after she left, standing in the darkness, her words still burning in his mind. I want to be surprised, just once. I want someone to pay attention to the things I never say out loud, to notice what I love, what moves me, what makes me feel alive. I'm tired of being strong. I want to be cherished. I want someone to make the first move so I don't always have to. I want to feel pursued, desired, seen, not for what I can do, but for who I am when no one's watching. And beneath that, in her elegant handwriting, I want to dance in an empty ballroom. I want flowers delivered for no reason. I want to wake up and find that someone has been paying attention to my life in ways I never noticed. I want to feel like someone's priority, not their afterthought. Alexander had read those words, and something had shifted in his chest, something dangerous and irrevocable. Because Serafina Grace Monroe, with her brilliant mind and her guarded heart and her secret longings, had been on his mind far more than any CEO should think about his creative director. He'd kept his distance, maintained professionalism, told himself that the pull he felt toward her was merely admiration for her talent, respect for her tenacity. But reading her words had shattered that careful lie. And in that moment, standing alone in the conference room with her journal in his hands, Alexander Dominic Ashford had made a decision that would change both of their lives. He would give her what she wanted, every single desire in that journal, one by one, without explanation, without revealing himself. It was wrong. He knew it was wrong. It was a violation of boundaries, an abuse of the knowledge he'd inadvertently gained. But he couldn't stop thinking about the loneliness beneath her words, the woman who gave so much of herself to her work, to her success, to maintaining the armor she needed in a world that constantly underestimated her. He couldn't stop thinking about how she'd looked tonight, exhausted and brilliant, and so carefully composed it broke something in him. So he would do this. He would give her these moments of being seen, being cherished, being surprised. And he would do it from the shadows, because if she knew it was him, it would taint everything. His position, her career, the professional dynamic they'd built. This way, she would simply experience the joy of having her desires fulfilled. And he would have the satisfaction of seeing her smile, really smile, even if she never knew the smile was meant for him. It was selfish. It was reckless. It was possibly the most unethical thing he'd ever considered. But as Alexander finally left the conference room, her words still echoing in his mind, he knew he was going to do it anyway. 3 days later, on a Monday morning that smelled of coffee and ambition, Serafina arrived at her office to find her assistant, Marcus Chen, waiting with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Miss Monroe, these came for you." He gestured to her desk. Sarah stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. Peonies, dozens of them. Soft pink and cream and white, arranged in a crystal vase that caught the morning light and scattered it across her office like captured starlight. They were her favorite flower, something she'd mentioned exactly once, years ago, in a casual conversation she barely remembered, but someone had remembered. "There's a card," Marcus said, practically vibrating with curiosity. Sarah approached slowly, her heart doing something strange and arrhythmic in her chest. She picked up the small cream envelope, her hands steadier than she felt. Inside, in elegant script on heavy cardstock, were just 4 words: "Because you deserve beauty." No signature. No explanation. Just those 4 words and the scent of peonies filling her office like a promise. Sarah sank into her chair, the card still in her hand, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she smiled, really smiled, at something that had nothing to do with work, with achievement, with proving herself. She smiled because someone, somewhere, had been paying attention. And in his office 3 floors above, Alexander Dominic Ashford watched the security feed on his computer, a feed he had no business watching, and saw that smile. It was worth it. Every ethical line he was crossing, every boundary he was blurring, every risk he was taking, for that smile, it was worth it. The peonies lasted for 9 days, and during those 9 days, Serafina found herself glancing at them more often than she cared to admit. They sat on her desk like a beautiful mystery, softening the sharp edges of contract negotiations and budget reviews with their delicate presence. She'd asked Marcus to investigate the delivery, casually, of course, as if she weren't desperately curious about the sender. But the florist had only logged anonymous client, prepaid account. A dead end wrapped in silk ribbon and fragrant petals. Vivienne Laurent, her best friend and the head of Ashford Global's public relations division, had other theories. "It's obviously someone who knows you well," Vivienne said over lunch at their usual spot, a French bistro 3 blocks from the office. She leaned forward, her dark eyes sparkling with mischief. "The question is, who pays that much attention?" Sarah stabbed at her salad niçoise with more force than necessary. "It could be anyone. A client, a vendor, someone trying to curry favor." "Peonies, Sarah, your favorite flower that you mentioned exactly once at a company retreat 2 years ago. That's not curry favor attention. That's I've been watching you attention." Vivian paused, letting that sink in. "Which is either incredibly romantic or slightly concerning. I'm leaning toward concerning." "You're leaning toward self-protection," Vivian corrected gently. "When was the last time someone did something thoughtful for you? Something that wasn't transactional?" The question landed harder than Vivian probably intended. Sarah set down her fork, suddenly less hungry. "I don't need romantic gestures. I need respect in the boardroom and recognition for my work. You can have both, you know." "You're allowed to want both." But wanting felt dangerous. Wanting meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk, and Sarah had built her career on calculated moves and impenetrable professionalism. There was no room for mystery admirers and anonymous flowers in that equation, or so she told herself. That night, she stayed late again, not because she had to, but because her apartment felt too quiet, too empty, too full of her own thoughts. She was reviewing the creative concepts for the upcoming Belmont acquisition when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Go to the rooftop. Alone. Trust me." Sarah stared at the message, her pulse quickening. The rational part of her brain, the part that had gotten her through Harvard Business School and a decade of corporate warfare, screamed that this was foolish, potentially dangerous, definitely inappropriate. But another part, a part she usually kept locked away, whispered, "When was the last time you did something just because it felt like an adventure?" She glanced around her empty office. The building was mostly deserted at 10:37 at night. She could ignore the message, delete it, pretend it never happened, or she could go. Sarah grabbed her phone and headed for the elevator, pressing the button for the rooftop access. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the elevator climbed floor after floor, carrying her towards something she couldn't name and probably shouldn't want. The rooftop was normally locked after hours, but tonight the door opened easily beneath her touch, and what she found on the other side stole her breath. The Manhattan skyline stretched in every direction, a glittering tapestry of light and ambition against the velvet darkness of the October sky. But it was the rooftop itself that made her throat tighten with emotion. Thousands of tiny lights, fairy lights, she realized, had been strung overhead, creating a canopy of stars that rivaled the real ones hidden behind the city's glow. In the center of the space, a table had been set for one, covered in white linen and surrounded by hurricane lanterns that flickered in the gentle breeze. Silver domes covered what she assumed were plates, and a bottle of wine. She could see even from here that it was Chateau Margaux, her favorite, sat breathing in a crystal decanter. But it was the music that made her freeze. Piano, live piano, coming from speakers hidden somewhere in the shadows, playing Debussy's Clair de Lune, the piece she'd listened to on repeat during her most difficult semester at Harvard. The piece that still made her feel both melancholy and hopeful. Someone had been paying attention. Not just attention, devotion-level attention to details she'd thought no one noticed. Sarah moved toward the table as if pulled by invisible strings, her professional composure fracturing with each step. A card sat propped against the wine bottle, and with trembling fingers she opened it. "You wrote that you wanted to dance in an empty ballroom." This isn't a ballroom, but it's empty, and the city is watching, and you deserve to feel like the only person in the world who matters. The dinner will stay warm. Dance first. I insist. Tears pricked at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back, looking around the empty rooftop. "Who are you?" she whispered to the darkness. No answer came. Only the music, swelling now into the main theme, and the lights above her head, and the impossible romance of this moment that shouldn't exist in her carefully structured life. So, Serafina Grace Monroe, who hadn't danced since her college roommate's wedding 5 years ago, who spent her life being composed and controlled and perfectly professional, kicked off her Louboutin heels and danced. She danced alone on a Manhattan rooftop with the city as her witness and stars, both real and artificial, as her ceiling. She danced because someone had noticed what she wanted. She danced because for the first time in years she felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with her resume or her last presentation or her quarterly results. She danced because she was lonely. And this mysterious gesture had touched something deep and aching in her chest that she'd been ignoring for far too long. And 3 floors below, in his office with the lights off and the security feed on, Alexander Dominic Ashford watched her dance and felt his heart do something it had no business doing. He'd arranged everything himself, had stayed late under the pretense of work, had hired the installation crew who'd set up the lights and the table, had personally selected every dish from the restaurant where he'd once heard her mention loving their truffle risotto. He'd done all of this knowing he shouldn't, knowing it was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But watching her now, watching her spin in the starlight with her guard finally down, her face tilted toward the sky, her movements free and unself-conscious, he knew he'd do it again and again, for every desire in that journal, for every longing she'd written in her elegant handwriting. When the song ended, Sarah stood still for a moment, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with exertion and emotion. Then she laughed, a sound of pure joy that carried down through the October air and landed somewhere in the vicinity of Alexander's chest like a physical blow. She approached the table, lifted the silver domes, and found truffle risotto, seared scallops with a champagne beurre blanc, roasted asparagus with lemon zest, and, for dessert, a chocolate soufflé that was somehow still warm, as if someone had timed its arrival perfectly, which of course someone had. Sarah ate slowly, savoring each bite, sipping the wine that tasted like velvet and oak and perfect Septembers in French vineyards. And she thought about the person who'd done this, who'd read her words, her private, vulnerable words, and instead of mocking them or using them against her, had turned them into this moment. It should have felt like a violation. In many ways, it was a violation, but it felt like being cherished. Her phone buzzed again, another text from the unknown number. "You have a beautiful smile. You should use it more often." Sarah's breath caught. She looked around wildly, suddenly aware that whoever this was could see her, was watching her right now. The thought should have been creepy, should have set off every alarm bell in her carefully cultivated sense of self-preservation. Instead, it sent a thrill down her spine. She typed back, "Who are you?" The response came immediately. "Someone who thinks you deserve more than you allow yourself to want. This is inappropriate." "Probably. Are you going to report me?" Sarah stared at her phone, at that question, at the truth it demanded. Was she going to report an anonymous person who'd given her the most romantic evening of her life, who'd made her feel seen and valued in ways that had nothing to do with her professional accomplishments? She typed, "I should, but you won't. Why are you doing this?" The pause before the next message felt weighted, significant. "Because someone should. Good night, Serafina. Thank you for dancing. It was the most beautiful thing I've seen in years." And then nothing. No more texts. Just Sarah on a rooftop under fairy lights, with the remnants of a perfect meal and a heart that was beating in a rhythm she didn't recognize. She stayed there for another hour, finishing her wine, looking out over the city that had been her battlefield and her home for the past 8 years, and she thought about desire and mystery and the dangerous appeal of being wanted by someone who knew her secrets. When she finally returned to her office to gather her things, she found one more surprise, a small, wrapped box on her desk that hadn't been there before. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a vintage edition of Anna Karenina, her favorite novel, the one she'd mentioned in passing during a team-building exercise 3 years ago. The margins were filled with penciled notes in handwriting she didn't recognize, observations about the passages that had clearly moved someone deeply. The card inside read, "You mentioned once that you'd lost your original copy in a move. May this one keep you company on the late nights when you refuse to go home at a reasonable hour. And may you remember you are not alone, even when you feel you are." Sarah sank into her office chair, clutching the book to her chest, and finally allowed the tears to come. Not tears of sadness, but of something more complex. Gratitude mixed with confusion, joy mixed with fear, longing mixed with the terrifying acknowledgement that someone out there was paying attention in ways that made her feel both incredibly vulnerable and strangely safe. In his car in the parking garage, Alexander sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, his heart pounding like he'd just run a marathon. He'd watched her through the security feeds until she'd left the rooftop. He'd slipped the book onto her desk while she was upstairs, taking a ridiculous risk that someone might see him, might question what the CEO was doing, skulking around the creative director's office at midnight. He should stop this. Now. Before it went any further, before the lines became so blurred they disappeared entirely. But the memory of her dancing, God, the memory of her dancing was seared into his brain, and he knew he wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not until every desire in that journal had been fulfilled. Not until she'd had every moment of joy and surprise and being cherished that she'd written about in the privacy of her own thoughts. Even if it destroyed him, even if it cost him everything. For Serafina Grace Monroe, it was worth it. The days that followed the rooftop dinner blurred into a strange new reality where Serafina's life seemed touched by invisible magic. Small things at first, things that could almost be coincidental if coincidences came wrapped in perfect knowledge of her deepest preferences. Her favorite coffee appeared on her desk every morning at exactly 7:45, an oat milk cortado with a single pump of vanilla and a whisper of cinnamon from the boutique cafe 8 blocks away that she only visited on special occasions because their prices were ridiculous and their coffee was transcendent. No note, no explanation. Just perfection in a porcelain cup that stayed mysteriously warm far longer than physics should allow. The book she'd been trying to find for months, a first edition of Toni Morrison's Beloved with the author's signature, appeared in her mailbox at home, wrapped in brown paper and twine, with a card that read simply, "Every collection needs its cornerstone." On a rainy Thursday afternoon, when the proposal she'd worked on for 6 weeks was rejected by a client in a particularly brutal fashion, a package arrived at her office containing her favorite comfort items: Belgian hot chocolate mix, cashmere socks in deep burgundy, a playlist of jazz standards on a custom USB drive, and a handwritten note that said, "Rejection is redirection. Your brilliance will find a better home. P.S. Take the afternoon off. I've already cleared your schedule." She checked her calendar. Every meeting after 2 o'clock had been mysteriously cancelled and rescheduled, with her assistant Marcus claiming he'd received an email from building management about necessary maintenance. It was the playlist that undid her, because whoever had made it had included songs she'd never told anyone she loved. Nina Simone's "I Put a Spell on You", Billie Holiday's "The Very Thought of You", Chet Baker's "My Funny Valentine". Songs her father had played when she was a child, songs that made her think of Sunday mornings and safety and a time before the world required her to be invincible. Someone was inside her life in ways that felt both deeply intimate and mildly terrifying. "You have a stalker," Vivienne announced over drinks at the Carlyle on Friday evening, gesturing with her martini for emphasis. An incredibly thoughtful, probably wealthy, definitely obsessed stalker. "That's not helpful, Viv." Sarah sipped her old-fashioned, savouring the bite of bourbon and the sweetness of the cherry. They'd claimed their usual spot at the bar, where the piano player knew them well enough to nod a greeting, but not interrupt. "What's not helpful is you pretending this is normal." Vivienne leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Someone is tracking your movements, Sarah. They know your schedule, your preferences, where you live. That's either wildly romantic or the beginning of a true crime podcast. It doesn't feel dangerous." Famous last words. But Vivienne was wrong. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt seen, cared for, pursued in a way that respected her boundaries even while crossing them. Whoever this person was, they never demanded anything in return, never revealed themselves, never made her feel pressured or uncomfortable. They just gave and gave and gave. "Have you made a list?" Vivian asked, ever practical despite her romantic heart. "Are people who could know all these things about you?" Sarah had. Of course she had. She'd spent the past week mentally cataloguing every conversation she'd ever had at Ashford Global, every casual mention of preferences, every unguarded moment that might have revealed something personal. The list was disturbingly short. Marcus, her assistant, knew some things, but not the music, not the books, and certainly not her coffee order from a cafe she'd never mentioned visiting. The IT department had access to her browsing history theoretically, but even that wouldn't explain the rooftop dinner or the vintage Anna Karenina, which left people higher up the food chain, people with resources, people who'd been around long enough to witness years of casual revelations, people like Alexander Ashford. The thought made her pulse quicken in a way that was distinctly unprofessional. She'd been trying not to think about her CEO in connection with this mystery, because thinking about him in connection with this mystery led to thinking about him in other ways entirely. Ways that involved his storm-grey eyes, and the way his voice dropped half an octave when he was focused, and the competence with which he commanded every room he entered. She'd been attracted to Alexander Ashford since approximately the third day of her employment at his company. She'd also been scrupulously professional about never ever acting on that attraction, but lately, especially since the night he'd returned her journal, there'd been something different in the way he looked at her. A new intensity, a heat that made her skin prickle with awareness every time they were in the same room. "You're thinking about someone specific," Vivian observed with the accuracy of a decade-long friendship. "Your face just did that thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you're trying not to feel something but you're feeling it anyway. Who is it?" Sarah shook her head, draining the last of her drink. "It's nothing. Just a theory I'm not ready to voice." Coward. Realist. But reality became harder to cling to as October faded into November and the gestures continued, each one more impossibly perfect than the last. On the first Tuesday of November, Serafina arrived at work to find her entire team assembled in the conference room, looking confused and slightly festive. Balloons in jewel tones, sapphire, emerald, amethyst, filled one corner of the room, and a catering setup occupied the far wall, complete with a champagne tower and breakfast pastries from Dominique Ansel. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, setting down her bag. Marcus approached with a grin. "Apparently it's Celebrate Serafina Day." The email came from Mr. Ashford himself this morning. He wanted the entire creative division to acknowledge your 5-year anniversary with the company, which was actually last month, but he said better late than never. Sarah's breath caught. Her 5-year anniversary had passed on October 7th, with no fanfare, no acknowledgement, which she'd expected and accepted. Anniversaries weren't really celebrated at Ashford Global, unless you hit major milestones like 10 or 20 years. But someone had remembered, and not just remembered, made it a company-wide event. "There's more," Marcus continued, clearly delighted. "Mr. Ashford also announced that the conference room on 47 is being renamed the Serafina Monroe Innovation Suite in recognition of your contributions to the company's creative vision. The plaque is being installed this afternoon." The room tilted slightly. Sarah gripped the back of a chair, overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement, the generosity of it, the way it made her feel both celebrated and exposed. "That's—" Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat. "That's incredibly kind." What she didn't say, it was also incredibly specific, because in her journal, buried among the romantic desires and secret longings, She'd written something she'd never admitted aloud. I want to be recognized for my work in ways that last. Not just bonuses or promotions, though those matter, but something permanent, something that says I was here, I mattered, I changed things. Someone had read those words and turned them into a conference room with her name on it. The celebration lasted an hour, filled with speeches from colleagues and toasts with champagne that probably cost more than her monthly rent. And through it all, Sarah smiled and thanked people, and felt increasingly certain that she knew exactly who was behind all of this. When the festivities finally ended and her team dispersed, Sarah made a decision. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the 45th floor, executive territory, and marched toward Alexander Ashford's office with her heart hammering and her professional composure hanging by a thread. His assistant, a sophisticated woman in her 50s named Patricia, looked up with polite surprise. "Ms. Monroe, do you have an appointment?" "No, but I need 5 minutes of Mr. Ashford's time. It's important." Patricia hesitated, then picked up her phone and spoke quietly. After a moment, she nodded. "Go ahead, he'll see you." Sarah walked past the desk, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped into Alexander's office, a space she'd been in dozens of times for meetings, but which suddenly felt charged with new significance. Alexander stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the New York skyline, his hands in his pockets. He turned as she entered, and the expression on his face, guarded but heated, professional but hungry, made her knees weaken. "Serafina." He said her name like a complete sentence. "Congratulations on your anniversary celebration. Was it you?" The words came out more directly than she'd intended, but she was done with subtlety. The flowers, the rooftop, the books, the coffee, the conference room, all of it. Was it you? Alexander's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, and Sarah watched emotions flicker across his face. Guilt, desire, resignation, something that looked almost like relief. "If I said yes," he finally responded, his voice low and careful, "what would you do?" "I don't know." Honesty felt like the only option now. "I should be angry. You read my private thoughts. You've been—" She struggled for the right word. "Orchestrating my life without my consent." "I know." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of his cologne, familiar now from late nights in adjacent conference rooms. "It's unethical. It's an abuse of power. It crosses every professional boundary we have. I know all of that, Serafina, and I did it anyway." "Why?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Alexander stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair at his temples, far enough that propriety remained technically intact. "Because you deserved to have those desires fulfilled. Because I couldn't stop thinking about how lonely those words sounded. Because—" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd never seen from him before. "Because watching you walk through this building every day, being brilliant and strong and so carefully controlled, I wanted to give you permission to want more, to have more, even if you never knew it came from me." Sarah's heart was doing acrobatics in her chest. "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." His eyes met hers, and the intensity there stole her breath. "It's just not the answer you're ready to hear." The air between them crackled with unspoken things, want and fear, and the dangerous chemistry that had been building for years beneath layers of professionalism and propriety. "This can't happen," Sarah said, even as her body swayed slightly toward his. "You're my boss. I've worked too hard to have my career defined by—" "I know." Alexander's voice was rough with restrained emotion. "Do you think I haven't thought about that? Every single day for the past 2 years. But reading your words, Serafina—" his hands clenched into fists at his sides, as if preventing himself from reaching for her. "I couldn't stand the idea of you thinking no one was paying attention, because I've been paying attention to everything. Every presentation where you dazzle the room, every late night where you refuse to go home, every small moment when you think no one's watching and your guard drops and I see who you really are beneath the armor." "Stop." Sarah held up a hand, her breathing unsteady. "You don't get to say things like that. Not here. Not when... When what?" He took one step closer, testing boundaries. "When I'm your CEO. When there are rules against this. When your career could be jeopardized. I'm aware of all the reasons this is impossible, Serafina. But I'm also aware that I've never felt this way about anyone. And reading your words was like reading my own heart written in your handwriting." The confession hung between them, raw and real and terrifying. Sarah forced herself to step back, to create distance, to remember who she was and what she'd worked for. "I need time to think, to process this." "Of course." Alexander's mask of professional composure slid back into place, though his eyes remained heated. "Take all the time you need." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Serafina!" She looked back. "For what it's worth, I don't regret it, any of it. Even if you decide you can never forgive me, even if this ruins everything, I got to see you dance. I got to make you smile. And that's worth whatever consequences come next." Sarah left without responding, because there was nothing she could say that wouldn't make this more complicated than it already was. But as she returned to her office and closed the door and pressed her back against it, she realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She wasn't angry. She should be furious about the invasion of privacy, the manipulation, the way he'd orchestrated moments in her life without her knowledge or consent. Instead, she felt alive, desired, seen in ways that transcended professional accomplishment. And that was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. That night, alone in her apartment overlooking the Hudson River, Sarah pulled out her journal and stared at the pages Alexander had read. Her desires laid bare in ink and vulnerability. And now she knew he'd read every word, had committed them to memory, had turned them into flowers and starlight and moments of impossible perfection. Her phone buzzed. A text from the same unknown number that had guided her to the rooftop. "I know you know now. I should disappear. But before I do, may I give you one more gift? The last one, the one you wanted most." Sarah's fingers trembled as she typed, "What gift?" The response came immediately. The gift of not being alone. The gift of being pursued. The gift of knowing that someone chooses you, not for what you do, but for who you are. Alexander. Serafina. Her name on the screen felt like a caress, like a promise, like the beginning of something that could either destroy her carefully built career or transform her entire life. "I need time," she wrote. "I know. Take it. I'll be here, waiting, hoping, but respecting whatever boundary you set. This is complicated. The best things usually are." Sarah set down her phone and looked out at the city lights, at the life she'd built through determination and sacrifice and careful control. And she thought about desire, not just wanting things, but allowing herself to be wanted, not just being strong, but being vulnerable enough to let someone see behind the armor. Alexander Ashford had seen, had read her secrets, and instead of using them against her, had turned them into gifts. But the question remained, what did she do with that knowledge? How did she navigate this impossible situation where her heart was pulling her toward a man who was simultaneously perfect and forbidden? She didn't have the answer. Not yet. But for the first time in years, Serafina Grace Monroe allowed herself to sit with uncertainty, with desire, with the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, wanting something for herself wasn't a weakness. It was the bravest thing she could do. For 3 days, Serafina avoided Alexander Ashford with the skill of someone who'd spent years navigating corporate politics. She rescheduled meetings, sent emails instead of visiting his office, and timed her arrivals and departures to minimize any chance of running into him in the elevator or the parking garage. It was cowardly, and she knew it. But she needed space to think, to process, to decide what she wanted versus what she should want. The problem was, every time she tried to be rational about the situation, her mind kept circling back to the way he'd looked at her in his office. Like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. The way his voice had dropped when he'd said her name. The way he'd admitted to crossing every line, not with excuses, but with the simple truth. Because I couldn't stop thinking about you. And underneath her professional concerns and career anxieties lived a truth she was finally ready to acknowledge. She wanted him too. Had wanted him since the first time he'd walked into a presentation she was leading and watched her with those storm-grey eyes, like she was the most fascinating person in the room. But wanting and having were two different countries separated by an ocean of complications. It was Vivian who finally staged an intervention, arriving at Sarah's office on Thursday afternoon with Thai takeout and the expression of someone who'd run out of patience. "Enough," she announced, closing the door and setting food containers on the desk. "You've been spiraling for 3 days, and I can't watch it anymore. Talk to me." Sarah looked up from the marketing proposal she'd been pretending to review. "There's nothing to talk about. The CEO of the company is secretly in love with you and has been orchestrating romantic gestures pulled directly from your private journal. That's not nothing, Sarah. That's a romance novel waiting to happen or a lawsuit waiting to be filed. Possibly both." "He's not—" Sarah stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Because Alexander had been pretty clear about his feelings, hadn't he? Maybe he hadn't used the word love, but everything else he'd said. Not what? Not interested? Not completely obsessed with you in a way that's both concerning and kind of beautiful? Vivian opened a container of pad thai and pushed it toward Sarah. "Eat, then tell me what you're actually afraid of." Sarah picked up a fork, mechanically. "I'm afraid that if I pursue this, everything I've worked for will be reduced to a cliché. The black woman who slept her way to the top. Never mind that I was already the creative director before anything happened. Never mind my Harvard MBA or my track record. People will only see the relationship." "Okay." Vivian nodded slowly. "That's a valid fear, but here's my question. Are you going to let fear of other people's perceptions dictate your entire life? Because that's exhausting, Sarah. Trust me, I've tried it. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Vivian's voice softened. "I understand that you've had to work twice as hard for half the recognition your entire career. I understand that being a black woman in corporate America means every move is scrutinized, every success questioned, every relationship examined for ulterior motives. I understand all of that, but I also know that you're miserable right now, avoiding the one person who clearly sees you and values you in ways that have nothing to do with your job performance." Sarah set down her fork, her appetite gone. "What if it doesn't work? What if we try this and it falls apart, and then I have to see him every day and—" "What if it does work?" Vivian interrupted gently. "What if you let yourself have this thing you clearly want, and it's everything you've been secretly hoping for?" Before Sarah could respond, her office phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID, Patricia, Alexander's assistant, and her heart did a complicated flip. "Ms. Monroe," Patricia's professional voice came through the speaker. "Mr. Ashford would like to see you in his office at your earliest convenience. He says it's urgent." Sarah exchanged a glance with Vivian. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." She hung up, smoothed her navy sheath dress, and checked her reflection in the compact mirror from her desk drawer. Professional, composed, no hint of the chaos beneath her carefully maintained exterior. "Go get him," Vivian said with a knowing smile. "And Sarah, whatever you decide, make sure it's what you want, not what you think you should want." The walk to Alexander's office felt both endless and too short. Sarah's heels clicked against marble, her heart keeping a different rhythm entirely. When she reached Patricia's desk, the assistant waved her through immediately. "He's expecting you." Sarah pushed open the door and stopped. Alexander stood by the windows again, but this time he wasn't alone. A younger man occupied one of the leather chairs facing the desk, early 30s, with similar features to Alexander, but softer, less defined. His suit was expensive but flashy, his posture casual in a way that bordered on disrespectful. Marcus Ashford, Alexander's younger brother and the company's chief financial officer. Sarah had dealt with him occasionally on budget matters and had always found him charming in a superficial way, all smile and no substance. "Ms. Monroe." Marcus stood, extending a hand. "Always a pleasure, Mr. Ashford." She shook his hand briefly, then looked to Alexander. "You wanted to see me?" Alexander's expression was carefully neutral, but she could read tension in the set of his shoulders. "Please, sit. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." Sarah settled into the chair farthest from Marcus, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap, body language of complete professionalism. "I'll be direct," Alexander began, his CEO voice firmly in place. "Someone has filed an anonymous complaint with Human Resources alleging workplace impropriety between us." The words hit her like ice water. "What?" "The complaint claims that you've received preferential treatment, the renamed conference room, accelerated project approvals, access to resources not available to other directors." Alexander's eyes met hers, and she saw apology there, mixed with something harder. Anger, she realized. He was furious, but not at her. "That's ridiculous," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady even as panic clawed at her throat. "Every recognition I've received has been earned. My performance reviews speak for themselves." "We know that." This from Marcus, who leaned forward with an expression of practiced concern. "But perception matters, Sarah. May I call you Sarah? And the perception of impropriety is almost as damaging as the real thing." She noticed he'd used her first name, while Alexander maintained formality. Calculated, she thought. Everything about Marcus felt calculated. "What does HR want?" she asked Alexander directly, ignoring his brother. "An investigation. Interviews with your team, review of your project approvals, examination of any personal communications between us." Alexander's jaw tightened. "It's standard protocol for this type of complaint." "And completely humiliating," Sarah added quietly. "Even if I'm cleared, the damage is done. People will wonder. They'll question every success I've had. Which is precisely why we need to handle this carefully." Marcus again, his tone too smooth. "I've actually been thinking perhaps it would be best if Sarah took a temporary leave of absence, just until the investigation is complete. Purely as a precaution, of course. Full pay, no impact on her record." "Absolutely not." Alexander's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Serafina has done nothing wrong. She's not going anywhere. Brother, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable." Alexander stood, a move that made him tower over Marcus and radiated authority. "What's not reasonable is punishing someone for an anonymous accusation with no evidence. Serafina stays. She continues her work, and the investigation will show exactly what I already know, that she's earned every recognition through talent, hard work, and exceptional performance." Marcus raised his hands in surrender, but Sarah caught the flash of something in his eyes. Satisfaction, anticipation. Of course, I'm just thinking of what's best for everyone involved, including you, Alexander. If there's even a hint of impropriety, there isn't. But Alexander's certainty wavered just slightly, and Sarah understood. There was impropriety. Maybe not in the professional sense, her work truly was exemplary, but in every other way that mattered. The flowers, the rooftop, the gifts pulled from her private thoughts. None of it had influenced her job performance or her evaluations, but try explaining that to an HR investigator. "I need to speak with Ms. Monroe alone," Alexander said, dismissing his brother with executive finality. "We'll reconvene on this matter tomorrow." Marcus stood, buttoning his jacket. "Of course, Sarah, try not to worry. I'm sure this will all blow over quickly." His smile didn't reach his eyes. When the door closed behind him, the office fell into heavy silence. It was him. Sarah spoke first, certainty solidifying in her gut. Marcus filed the complaint. Alexander turned to face her fully. "I suspect so, yes, though I can't prove it." "Why would he do that?" "Because he's been lobbying the board to make him co-CEO for the past year. Because he thinks I'm distracted and vulnerable. Because—" Alexander stopped, choosing his words carefully. "Because he knows I care about you, and he's trying to use that as a weapon." The admission hung between them, more powerful for being spoken in this context, not as romance, but as vulnerability, as risk, as the thing that could potentially destroy them both professionally. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Sarah said quietly. "This is why I can't." "Don't." Alexander moved closer, stopping just within the boundaries of professional distance. "Don't let him win by giving up before we've even started." "Started what, Alexander?" She looked up at him, letting him see her fear, her frustration, her longing. "A relationship that will be scrutinized and questioned and used against both of us? That's not starting something, that's walking into a trap. Then we spring the trap on our own terms." His voice was low, intense. "We're honest. We tell HR that yes, I've developed feelings for you. Yes, I've pursued you in ways that were probably inappropriate, but no, it hasn't affected your professional standing because your work is exemplary and always has been. We control the narrative before Marcus does." "You're talking about disclosing a personal relationship that doesn't even exist yet." Sarah stood, needing to be on equal footing. "We've never even been on a date. We've shared one conversation where feelings were acknowledged. That's it." "Is it?" Alexander took one more step, close enough now that she could feel the heat of him, smell his cologne, see the silver in his eyes. "Because it feels like more than that to me, Serafina. It feels like I've been falling for you for 2 years and just finally had the courage, or the recklessness, to do something about it." Her breath caught. "This could ruin both of us." It could. He lifted one hand, not quite touching her but close enough that she felt the ghost of contact. "Or it could be the beginning of something extraordinary. But either way, I need you to know I don't regret any of it. Not the flowers, not the rooftop, not reading your journal, even though I know I shouldn't have. Because it led me here, to this moment, where I'm standing in front of you and finally being honest about what I want." "And what do you want?" The question came out barely above a whisper. "You. Everything with you. The late-night conversations and the challenging debates and the way you laugh when you think no one's listening. I want to take you to dinner and argue about art and wake up next to you and watch you conquer the world. I want all of it, Serafina, in whatever form you're willing to give it." Tears pricked at her eyes, dangerous, unwelcome tears that she blinked back through sheer force of will. "What if I'm not willing to risk everything for this?" "Then I'll respect that." His hand dropped. "I'll step back. I'll maintain every professional boundary. I'll watch you from a distance and be grateful for every moment I got to know you, even if it's not in the way I want. But I'm asking, begging, really. Don't make that decision out of fear. Make it because it's truly what you want." Sarah stood at a crossroads, feeling the weight of every choice, every consequence, every possible future branching out from this moment. She could walk away, protect her career, maintain the armor she'd built so carefully over years of fighting for respect in rooms that didn't want to give it to her. Or she could step forward into the unknown, risk everything for the possibility of being loved the way her journal entries had wished for, completely, attentively, with someone who saw behind her defenses and chose her anyway. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, but not the one Alexander had been using. She pulled it out, her blood running cold as she read, "Touching scene." The security cameras in Alexander's office are very high definition. Would be a shame if footage of this conversation ended up with the board of directors. But we can discuss terms. Meet me in the parking garage, level B3, 10 minutes. Come alone, or this gets very public very fast. M. Sarah's hands trembled as she showed the message to Alexander. She watched his expression shift from confusion to fury to something that looked like murder. "Marcus," he growled. "He's been watching, planning this. He has footage of us," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror flooding her system. "Of this conversation, where you just admitted to pursuing me inappropriately. Alexander, that's blackmail and proof that he's dangerous." Alexander was already moving, grabbing his jacket. "I'm going with you. He said to come alone. I don't care what he said. You're not meeting him without me. Alexander!" She grabbed his arm, stopping him. "If we both go, he'll know he has leverage over us. Let me handle this. I can—" "No!" The word came out as an absolute. "Whatever Marcus is planning, whatever he wants, we face it together. That's not negotiable, Serafina." She looked into his eyes and saw something that made her heart ache, not just desire or attraction, but genuine care. Protection. Partnership. The thing she'd written about wanting in her journal, someone who chose to stand beside her, not behind her or ahead of her. "Together then," she agreed quietly. "But let me do the talking." Alexander nodded once, and together they walked out of his office, toward the parking garage, toward whatever confrontation Marcus had planned, toward the moment where everything would either fall apart or finally begin. The parking garage on level B3 smelled of concrete and exhaust fumes, a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the floors above. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, and the echo of their footsteps announced their arrival long before they reached the designated meeting spot. Marcus Ashford leaned against a silver Maserati, scrolling through his phone with studied casualness. He looked up as they approached, and Sarah saw the moment his expression shifted from smug satisfaction to irritation. "I said come alone, Sarah." His tone remained pleasant, but steel underneath. "And I said we handle this together." Alexander's voice was granite. "Whatever you think you have, Marcus, now's the time to play your hand." Marcus pocketed his phone, his smile sharpening into something uglier. "Always so dramatic, brother. This doesn't have to be adversarial. I'm simply looking out for the company's best interests. By blackmailing the creative director?" Sarah stepped forward, her fear transmuting into anger, cleaner, more useful. "That's an interesting definition of best interests." "Blackmail is such an ugly word." Marcus circled them slowly, like a shark sensing blood. "I prefer to think of it as protecting shareholder value. You see, when the CEO is compromised by an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate, it creates liability. Legal exposure, reputational damage. The board needs to know. Then tell them. Alexander's words stopped Marcus mid-stride. Go ahead, show them whatever footage you have. We'll tell them the truth, that I developed feelings for Serafina, that I pursued her in ways that were personally inappropriate, but never professionally, that her work has always been exemplary and completely independent of our personal connection. You think they'll believe that? Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off concrete walls. You think the optics of the CEO giving special treatment to the black woman he's sleeping with? Careful. Alexander's voice dropped to a dangerous register. Finish that sentence, and I'll have you removed from this company before morning. You can't touch me. I have board support. You have the support of 2 board members who don't know you've been embezzling funds from the Singapore division for the past 18 months. Alexander delivered the words like bullets. Did you think I wouldn't notice, Marcus? That I wouldn't investigate when the numbers stopped adding up? The color drained from Marcus's face. You're bluffing. Am I? Check your email. I sent the forensic accounting report to your personal account about... Alexander glanced at his watch. 3 minutes ago. It's very thorough. Details every transaction, every falsified expense report, every offshore account you thought was hidden. I've been building the case for months. Sarah watched Marcus's swagger crumble, revealing the desperate small man beneath. But she also saw something else. Cunning. The cornered animal look of someone with nothing left to lose. If I go down, I'm taking you both with me. Marcus pulled out his phone again. I'll send this footage to every media outlet in New York, the CEO and his protege. The narrative writes itself. Even if you're cleared of wrongdoing, Sarah, your reputation will be destroyed, every achievement questioned, every future opportunity tainted. Is that really what you want? The question hung in the stale air of the parking garage, and Sarah felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. Because he was right. Even if they won legally, even if the investigation cleared her, the story would spread. The whispers would follow her for years. This was the moment, the choice that would define everything. She could walk away, distance herself from Alexander, protect her career, maintain the armor she'd built so carefully. It was the safe choice. The smart choice, the choice that every advisor and mentor would tell her to make. Or she could step forward into the fire and fight. Sarah looked at Alexander, at the man who'd read her private thoughts and turned them into magic instead of weapons, who'd stood beside her in his office and offered partnership instead of protection, who'd just weaponized his own brother's crimes to defend her. Consequences be damned. And she made her choice. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus. Sarah's voice was steady, clear, carrying the authority of someone who'd earned every inch of her position through brilliance and determination. You're going to delete that footage. You're going to withdraw your anonymous HR complaint, and you're going to resign from Ashford Global, effective immediately. Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. Or what? You'll report me. With what proof besides Alexander's accusations? With this proof. Sarah pulled out her own phone and hit play on a recording app. Marcus's voice filled the garage. Blackmail is such an ugly word. The CEO and his protege. The narrative writes itself. Even if you're cleared of wrongdoing, Sarah, your reputation will be destroyed. Marcus's face went ashen. You recorded this conversation? I did, and I've already uploaded it to a secure cloud server with instructions to send copies to the SEC, the FBI, and every major news outlet if anything happens to either of us. Sarah stepped closer, and for the first time, she saw fear in Marcus's eyes. You made a miscalculation, Marcus. You assumed I'd be too scared to fight back. That I'd choose safety over truth, but I didn't build my career by backing down from bullies. The embezzlement evidence goes to the authorities tomorrow morning regardless, Alexander added. But if you resign tonight quietly, We won't add blackmail and corporate espionage charges. You'll face the financial crimes, but you might avoid prison time if you cooperate. That's more mercy than you deserve." Marcus looked between them, Sarah with her phone still recording, Alexander with his executive fury barely contained and seemed to deflate. The fight drained out of him, leaving behind only a bitter, defeated man. "You two deserve each other," he spat. "Both so self-righteous, so convinced you're better than everyone else." "We're done here." Alexander's voice carried finality. "Security will escort you from the building. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings. After that, your access is revoked." Marcus opened his mouth to say something else, thought better of it and walked away, his expensive shoes echoing against concrete, his Maserati left behind like everything else he was about to lose. When the elevator doors closed on him, Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation drained away, leaving her shaking. "You were magnificent." Alexander's voice was soft with something that sounded like awe. "The recording was brilliant. I learned a long time ago to protect myself." Sarah saved the recording, then looked up at him. "But I didn't know if I could actually go through with it, confronting him, choosing this path instead of the safe one. You chose truth. You chose to fight instead of hide. That's not recklessness, Serafina. That's courage. Or stupidity." She laughed, the sound edged with exhaustion. "My career is still going to be under scrutiny. People will still talk. The investigation will still happen." "Yes." Alexander moved closer, and this time there was no pretense of professional distance. "And we'll face it together. Full transparency with HR, full disclosure to the board. We'll do everything by the book from here on out. Establish proper protocols. Maybe have you report to someone other than me to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Whatever it takes to protect your reputation and your career. That's assuming I even want to continue this." Sarah met his eyes, needing him to understand the magnitude of what she was risking. "A relationship with you, with everything that implies." "Do you?" The vulnerability in his voice, Alexander Dominic Ashford, CEO and billionaire, sounding uncertain, made her heart clench. "Want to continue this?" Sarah thought about her journal entries. About wanting to be seen, to be cherished, to be chosen. About her fear of vulnerability and her exhaustion with always being strong. About the peonies and the rooftop and the books that showed someone had been paying attention in ways no one else ever had. "I want—" She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "I want to try, with boundaries, with honesty, with the understanding that my career and my autonomy are non-negotiable. I won't be defined by this relationship, Alexander. I won't let myself become the CEO's girlfriend instead of Serafina Monroe, creative director and woman who earned everything she has. I would never ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are." He lifted his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the corporate warrior she'd just witnessed. "You're brilliant, Serafina. You're talented and driven and so beautiful it hurts to look at you sometimes. Any man would be honored to stand beside you, not in front of you, not behind you, beside you." Pretty words. But she was smiling now, her professional armor finally lowering. "Can you back them up? Give me the chance, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." He leaned in slowly, asking permission with his eyes, and Sarah made another choice, the easiest one she'd made all night. She kissed him. It was nothing like the dramatic first kisses in movies. No swelling music, no perfect lighting. They were in a parking garage that smelled like exhaust, both of them emotionally exhausted, professionally compromised, standing in the wreckage of the confrontation with Marcus. But it was perfect anyway, because it was honest, because it was chosen. because it was two people who'd finally stopped pretending they didn't want each other and stepped into the terrifying, exhilarating reality of actually trying. When they finally pulled apart, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I suppose we should go deal with HR, and the board, and the inevitable gossip, and the investigation." "Together?" he asked. "Together," she confirmed. 8 months later, the Serafina Monroe Innovation Suite on the 47th floor of Ashford Global had been featured in 3 design magazines, and Sarah still felt a swell of pride every time she walked past the bronze plaque with her name on it. But today, she was headed somewhere else. The rooftop had been transformed again, this time not secretly, but with full cooperation and planning. The fairy lights that had enchanted her that October night 8 months ago had been made permanent, now joined by potted trees and comfortable seating, and a space that felt like an urban oasis above the Manhattan chaos. Alexander stood waiting by the railing, looking out over the city they'd both conquered in different ways. He turned as she approached, and the smile that spread across his face, warm, unguarded, completely hers, made her heart do the same complicated flip it had been doing for months now. "Ms. Monroe." He held out a hand, pulling her close. "You're late." "I'm exactly on time. You're just always early." She kissed him briefly, comfortable now with the casual intimacy that had developed between them over months of navigating their relationship with careful transparency and fierce protection of her professional independence. The HR investigation had cleared them both after 6 weeks of interviews and scrutiny. Sarah now reported directly to the COO instead of Alexander, eliminating any direct chain of command issues. They'd established strict protocols about separating personal and professional discussions, and they'd endured the gossip, the speculation, the occasional think piece about workplace relationships and power dynamics, together. Marcus had pleaded guilty to embezzlement and was currently serving a 3-year sentence in a minimum security facility. The board had voted unanimously to increase Alexander's authority and had offered Sarah a seat on the executive team, an offer she'd accepted on her own terms, with her own conditions, making it clear she was there because of her talent, not her relationship. "I have something for you." Alexander handed her a wrapped package. "It's not my birthday. It's the anniversary of the night you danced on this rooftop. That feels worth celebrating." Sarah unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal, new, unmarked, full of blank pages, and tucked inside a card in his familiar handwriting. "For all the new desires, new dreams, new chapters of a life we're writing together. May you always feel free to want more, to be more, to demand everything you deserve, and may I always be worthy of reading your words, this time with permission. Always yours, A." Tears pricked at her eyes, happy tears this time, the kind that came from being seen and chosen and loved exactly as she was. "Thank you," she whispered, "for all of it. The flowers, the rooftop, the books. For fighting for me, for fighting with me, for standing beside me even when it was complicated. Thank you for taking the risk." Alexander pulled her closer, his arms around her waist. "For choosing courage over safety, for not letting fear dictate your life, for showing me what partnership really looks like." Sarah looked out over the city, at the life she'd built through determination and sacrifice and refusing to be anything less than she was, and she thought about the girl who'd written in her journal about wanting to be seen, to be cherished, to be surprised. She'd gotten all of that, but more importantly, she'd learned something else. The greatest gift wasn't being chosen by someone else. It was choosing herself, her desires, her boundaries, her worth, and refusing to compromise that for anyone or anything. Alexander had simply been brave enough to see that strength and love her for it, not despite it. "Dance with me?" he asked softly, As music began to play from the speakers, Debussy's Clair de Lune, their song now. Always, Sarah answered. And under the fairy lights, and the Manhattan stars, and the city that had witnessed their entire story, Seraphina Grace Monroe danced with the man who'd read her secrets and turned them into a love story worth every risk, every complication, every terrifying moment of vulnerability. She danced because she wanted to, because she chose to, because she was finally, beautifully, completely free to want everything and to have it on her own terms, and that was the greatest desire fulfilled of all.